Okay, well, there is a bit of a disturbance in the force which unites Ontario and Quebec with Western premiers. Initial approval of the Energy East pipeline that Mr. Mulcair was talking about by the two largest provinces is now conditional approval. The Premier of Saskatchewan is not terribly impressed with all this. Brad Wall joins me from Regina. Welcome to the program, Premier Wall.
Don, it's good to be back. Thanks.
All right, you're hearing me. Perfect. I'm a little confused. About 3/4 of this pipeline is already sending natural gas east to west, yet they reverse the flow of crude, and all these new conditions go on for approval. What's the problem, and what's the effect of that?
I'm also very confused and concerned. I had thought of all of the pipelines that are proposed and are subject to debate in the country, reasonable debate, obviously we should have the discussion, that this one would engender the least controversy. We are talking about replacing oil that Canada imports currently from places like Iraq and Algeria and Venezuela, the United States, Saudi Arabia, with Canadian oil, with Western Canadian oil from Alberta and Saskatchewan. We are talking about, Thomas Mulcair is right, we're talking about the chance to add value to our oil rather than just export it. That would happen in Quebec, where refineries would get access to oil at a lower price, West Texas versus the world Brent price. Same with refineries in New Brunswick. We're talking about moving more oil off of the rail cars, and we all know the risks there, into the pipeline. I did note what your guest had to say about the efficacy of moving oil by pipeline. I just don't understand why we would want to put up any additional barriers to this. I do not understand for the life of me why one of those barriers might be some sort of subjective assessment about the GHG impact of Energy West. It's hard to even define what that might be, and more concerning, I think, Don, is the precedent it might set in terms of moving goods and services, and not just hydrocarbons, but goods in general across the country. If suddenly a GHG footprint and a provincial government's concern about that could pose a potential barrier.
Well, do you think these conditions are going to be like an inconvenience in the approval process, or do you think it actually threatens the project?
Well, that is a great question. I think that's why we're speaking out today in the legislature. We passed a unanimous motion passed a motion unanimously with the support of the NDP opposition to encourage Ontario and Quebec to recognize the NEB process, which will be rigorous, which forces the company to respond to all inquiries around safety, consultation with First Nations, with communities. The motion that we pass says, let's respect that process. Let's not add any barriers that potentially are politically driven. I think a delay is possible as a result of all this, and I hope nothing worse than that. But we really should get on with it. This is about replacing foreign oil in Canada with Canadian oil. If you talk to most Canadians who are aware of our oil production, Don, I think they'd be shocked that we import oil in significant amounts from the Middle East, from Algeria and Iraq and the countries I mentioned. But we do. Right. Here's our chance to stop doing that. Here's our chance to add more value. I've seen on social media some people saying, well, what about the tanker traffic off Atlantic Canada? You know, these arguments don't make any sense. How is the Iraqi oil getting here today? Not the oil ferry. So I just hope that we can, all of us, the companies, the provinces, get the facts on the table and have support both in Quebec and Ontario, not just for the jobs that will be created and the additional tax revenue, and Deloitte says most of that will occur in Ontario and Quebec, but because this makes sense for Canada to replace foreign oil and to add value here at home.
I'm curious why one of the big beneficiaries of this pipeline would be New Brunswick. Why the new Premier of New Brunswick, Premier Gallant, doesn't seem to think this is an issue. Is he being a little naive on that?
Well, you know, and I hope he's right. And I know, you know, I've talked to Premier Prentice about it as well, and I think we're responding to concerns from Quebec and Ontario are reasonable. A lot of the questions they have are reasonable, and I think they'll be answered in the NEB process. The GHG issue is different, and I worry about that one. So I hope that it's a reasonable expectation that, you know, these questions can be solved informally outside the formal process and no delay happens. But Don, I don't want us to be complacent. I think we were complacent on Keystone. I think maybe that happened a bit on Gateway and other projects that would have been good for Canada as an sustainable and responsible energy power in the world. And I just, now with the pronouncements by the premiers of Ontario and Quebec, I think we ought not to be complacent. So let's get the facts out there. I think Premier Prentice is going to Quebec and to meet next week or the week after, and Ontario subject to that. I've talked to Premier Couillard, a good discussion. I'll be discussing things, I hope, tomorrow with Premier Wynne. But we ought not to be complacent. This is an important project, and honestly, as Mr. Mulcair has said, it makes sense on any number of levels.
I'm just curious if I could. You saw the vote in the Senate against the Keystone Pipeline, fell one vote shy, and yet it's going to be resurrected under the new Senate under Republican control in the next couple of months. But is there a sense in your mind that the Keystone Pipeline is dead under the Obama administration?
Yeah, I think there's that sense. I would hope that it's not completely, but for the first time ever, just in advance of that vote in the Senate, Don, we heard the president come out with a substantive argument against the pipeline, where he was saying, look, this just benefits Canada. It doesn't benefit us. That represents a change. The president really was, I think, much more neutral and indicating a willingness to wait for further review by the State Department and the court case in Nebraska. What we saw in advance of the vote was a president that it sounded like he had an opinion, and it wasn't in favor of Keystone. He wrote it off as something good for Canada and not necessarily good for the United States. So I'm not sure that even with a vote, it would have been, obviously the presidential signature is required at the end of the day. We might have to wait until after an election. Now, we'll find out soon enough, because you're right, when the new Congress is sworn in, I think that vote will happen again. And if it almost passed under the old Senate configuration, it most assuredly will pass with more Republicans there. So I think we're going to find out what the president really thinks about Keystone in the months ahead.
All right. That's interesting development as well. Thank you, Premier Brad Wall. We'll hopefully talk to you in the near future.
Thanks, Don.